everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, all about what's happening in Washington and its impact on the education market. We appreciate everyone joining us today. Before we start the program, I'm just going to review a few quick housekeeping items. We've got a lot of information to cover about the budget and education policy and what all this means for your business, but we are going to leave some time at the end of the presentation for questions. You can go ahead and send in your questions as they come up for you, and we'll put them in the queue to be answered at the end. To send a question, simply click the Questions tab on your control panel, type the question into the top box, and then click on the Send button. And like I said, I'll receive that question and I'll put it into the queue to be answered during the Q&A period. If you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use that same question feature on your control panel to get my attention, and I'll do my best to resolve the problem for you. We are recording today's webinar, and we'll provide you with a copy of that along with the PowerPoint slides, and keep an eye on your inbox to receive those later tomorrow. There's a lot of numbers and a lot of stats, so you're probably going to want to scribble notes, but just be assured you will get a copy of the slides so you've got everything to reference later. Now let's get started. I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Doug Mesecar. Doug has a diverse background, having held senior operational and policy roles at leading education companies, the U.S. Department of Education, and in Congress. Doug is currently Senior Vice President of Corporate Strategy for IO Education. In this role, he oversees IO Education's professional growth solutions, including educator effectiveness, professional learning, and principal leadership. He also helps inform and direct IO's strategic business direction across all products and functions. During his time with the U.S. Department of Education, Doug held a number of senior roles, including Deputy Chief of Staff of the Department, Assistant Deputy Secretary for the Office of Innovation and Improvement, and Acting Assistant Secretary for the Office of Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development. During his time on Capitol Hill, Doug was a professional staff member for the Education and Workforce Committee in the House of Representatives. In addition to his current work with IO Education, Doug writes on education technology and policy for the Lexington Institute and mentors EdTech startups through GSV Labs. Doug attended Hope College and the University of Denver, where he completed graduate work in education and earned his teaching license. From there, he went on to teach 5th grade in the Jefferson County School System in Colorado. He currently lives near Washington, D.C. with his wife, children, and dogs. We are really pleased to have Doug back with us today. He always has lots of valuable information to share, so I'm going to go ahead and hand the program over to him.
Great. Thank you so much. Great to be back with you all, and there is a lot to cover. As was said just a minute or two before, lots of facts and figures to run through, which is a good thing. So without any further delay, let's jump in here. So for our topics today, we've got a number of areas to hit, but first and foremost, we're going to talk about the federal education funding outlook and reality. So we have 2018 numbers, which is great and long overdue. And I'll spend a little bit of time talking through what that may mean for 2019. We'll talk about where we're at with ESSA state plans and some other ESSA policies. We'll get into a few regulatory changes and some other statutes. So we'll kind of go further afield from ESSA, but we'll cover that ground toward the end. We'll also talk a little bit about what's going on with the Trump administration, particularly as regards the U.S. Department of Education. There's a lot of changes being proposed in how the department is organized, and those are worth keeping an eye on. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about what all this means for the marketplace, for districts, for vendors. So a lot to cover. Let's jump in. So fiscal year 2018, now that we're 3/4 of the way through it, we're finally got a final bill. We've been on continuing resolutions up until now. And after a little bit of drama, veto drama at the last second, ultimately the bill was signed. And so we have a lot of numbers and, frankly, a lot of good news. And sometimes a lack of bad news passes for good news when it comes to Washington, D.C., but there are actually some increases. So let's dive into those. Title I, Not a huge increase, but $300 million is more than I expected. So it's up to $15.8 billion. So that was a nice increase for Title I. Title II, it was not cut and it was not zeroed out. So this is sort of the absence of bad news is good news. So it was level. I will just say that there continues to be a lot of pressure on the Title II dollars, particularly because the administration, but I believe others on the Hill, are questioning how effective those dollars are. So, as districts think about using Title II dollars, as companies are working with districts, being able to show evidence of impact on teacher professional development, on student achievement is critical. Because you will hear from the Trump administration that they are targeting programs without a lot of evidence of actual impact on student achievement primarily, but other quantifiable measures. But for this year, Title II survives, and it survives at last year's number, so the $2.1 billion. So Title III, no surprise here. Title III was level funded, and that's sort of what everybody expected. So not a big surprise there. Here is far and away the biggest news, in my opinion, from the FY18 budget deal. Title IV, the block grant, was increased by $700 million. So it went from $400 million to $1.1 billion, which is massive. Particularly massive in the face of the Trump administration asking to zero this program out. So some of this, will go toward some school safety measures. As you all know, that's been in the news, and the unfortunate shootings that have taken place have really elevated school safety issues. And in Title IV, there are three areas that dollars can be used. Well-rounded efforts around well-rounded students, well-rounded education, safe and healthy schools. So obviously that's going to be an area of focus. And then the effective use of technology is the third area. Now, to be clear, there's no requirement in the omnibus, in the budget that just passed, that those dollars have to be used for school safety. So they can be spread between the three different areas in Title IV. Just keep in mind that Title IV has a $30,000 threshold, that if a district receives more than $30,000 from Title II, they do have to do a needs analysis. So that will start to come into play as these dollars start hitting district budgets. They will have to go through a needs assessment process before these dollars can be released. So it's an important part of the process, but it will sort of delay things a little bit. Again, this was the biggest increase of any of the titles in ESSA, and frankly, a bit of a surprise. So that's an important one. And between Title I and Title IV, those are the two most flexible. Well, Title II is pretty flexible as well, but in terms of the broad range of activities, Title I and Title IV are two of the most flexible titles in ESSA. So that's an important thing, particularly as state budgets continue, at least in some states, to be under pressure at the state or local level. Some of these increased dollars from the feds will definitely be welcome. 21st Century Community Learning Centers, just to continue through here, saw a small increase. But again, this is sort of the absence of bad news is good news situation, because 21st Century has been targeted by the Trump administration for being completely cut. I don't ever see that happening. 21st Century has one of the strongest advocacy lobbying groups around. Everybody sees the need for after school, but I will say that the evidence of impact on 21st Century is not something that you can really go to the bank with. So I think 21st Century is much safer in the long run than Title II, but it still faces pressure. Impact aid, and I'll talk more about impact aid later, but it got a nice plus up to $1.27 billion. IDEA was another big gainer. Again, in the scheme of things, this isn't a huge increase, but $275 million additional dollars is, in my opinion, nothing to sort of sniff at. So you can see it's up to $12.28 billion overall. Education, innovation, and research saw a small increase. There's also some language in the report that accompanies the bill that talks about funding for STEM initiatives. So that was another nice increase. You can see here the Stop Violence Act. These are funds that are redirected from DOJ, and this kind of taps into some of the school safety concerns and needs that are out there. So all of elementary and secondary here, a lot of really positive news. And then, as I was just sort of talking about, there are some policy provisions within the legislation as well. And I'm going to go through a few of these here. I just wanted to highlight, for example, research-based interventions. So when you look at the research dollars in the bill, they're really, Congress is asking the department to focus on neuroscience, cognitive development, psychology, and human development. So really trying to promote research-based interventions to improve academic outcomes for high-need, high-poverty students. So it's just an important sort of area of focus and something Congress is putting pressure on the department about. Supporting effective educator development. I won't read through all of this, but it's just important to note that, you know, back to my comments around Title II, Congress is looking at, you know, implementing evidence-based activities to scale up programs across the country, particularly around early childhood and early elementary, but around social emotional learning, behavior management, school climate. So this is, again, Congress trying to, you know, send some smoke signals to the department. So this is not binding language. It's more sort of recommended, but it's just interesting to give you some visibility into how Congress is thinking. And then here's some language around seclusion and restraint. You've probably seen some of the stories around these issues. The Congress is directing the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, to further study and report back on the use of seclusion and restraint. So more to come on that, but I thought it was an interesting sort of policy rider. There's a few more here. Child Nutrition Act. You can see how they're trying to set some reservations, trying to set some thresholds around how those dollars are used. I am not an expert on child nutrition, but I thought this is important to note that there's some language in there. And then here is, you may be wondering, well, what about all the choice provisions in the Trump administration's budget requests? And none of them are there. And not only are they not there, but you may have heard, and I'll talk about this more later, that the secretary is trying to do some reorganization of the Department of Ed by, for example, completely dismantling what's called the budget service, which is responsible for putting all the budget tables together for the department. Well, Congress basically told the secretary that she can't do it. So it's pretty notable that Congress doesn't often get into the inner workings of how a department is structured, but in this case they did, and they also added more money to OCR. Now you can see an OCR, Office for Civil Rights. This is clearly, you know, some positioning around the election that's coming up in November, but it was notable in sort of directing the secretary on how to manage the department. And then here is the point that I started with. No money for choice. So charter schools got a small plus up. They're at $400 million. But in terms of any private school choice, any Title I portability, no money at all for that. So, you know, the administration's budgets have not gone very far on the hill. And in fact, Congress has almost gone in the direct opposite direction in a few different places. So there's a lot of good news here. Additional dollars coming. Policy-wise, I think some helpful policies as well. And overall, this sort of sets the stage for 19. Now, real quick, I'll run through early learning. Child Care Development Block Grant got a big increase. Head Start was increased. Preschool development grants were level funded, so that's pretty solid. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on higher ed. These are some of the sort of crossing higher ed and K-12 programs. But again, a nice number of increases here. I will note that the last bullet, second to the last bullet, excuse me, there is money in the budget here for open educational resources. Now, this is more on the higher ed side, but you should be aware that this has been an area of emphasis for the department for both K-12 and higher ed. So something to keep an eye on if you're really looking at curricular trends and how the federal government is handling any sort of curriculum creation that they're funding. They're going to be looking for those to be OER. So that's another important point to keep an eye on. So that leads us to 2019 and kind of, let's pull out our crystal balls here. In a lot of ways, the way the government tends to work absence a crisis is that the prior year funding level sets the threshold or the baseline for the next year's funding level. And particularly given that we're heading into an election year, if we have, as we did this year, more continuing resolutions, what that means is that a continuing resolution funds the government at the prior year level. So that starts to say, wow, well, Title I, that $300 million increase is now going to get funded into 2019. Title IV, with that huge increase, could potentially be funded at that level into 2019. Congress, when it's not an election year, has trouble getting a budget done and getting appropriations done in an election year, particularly when a lot of people think that there could be change of control, either on the Senate side or on the House, or potentially both, that the most likely outcome is to kick the can down the road and sort of leave these dollars in place, partly to avoid big fights, but partly also the Democrats are not likely going to want to compromise a whole lot because they may be getting a whole bunch more control back, and Republicans just want to go home and campaign and try to save their seats. So it just gives you a feel for, as you think about the next fiscal year, which is not that far away, we're likely to see a series of continuing resolutions. Whatever the Trump administration proposes in terms of their budget, you've already seen this with the last couple of years. It's more true than ever, and it's kind of true of every president, but their budget proposals are dead on arrival, and particularly around choice and around some of what DeVos has been trying to do with the department. I don't see much of that happening. I certainly don't see any choice proposals getting funded. DeVos has also had a pretty contentious relationship with the Hill, primarily with Democrats, but it was interesting when she went up to the Hill a couple of weeks ago to talk about the FY19 budget. She got some pushback from Republicans. Now, that's not totally unprecedented, but it just sort of goes to show that the Trump administration and DeVos in particular are definitely running into some headwinds when it comes to their proposals on education spending and policy. I've talked about the elections. It's hard to say, the stock market has been down the last few weeks. The tax cuts seems to be getting more popular. Where this, and clearly, we may be in some sort of trade war at some point of some type with China or others. So that also bodes for, I think, a more conservative outlook for education funding. So again, if FY18 numbers are carried through into 19, I wouldn't expect 19 to see significant increases. If Congress changes hands, that may be different. But even if Congress changes hands, there's always some degree of sort of chaos and confusion as there's a transition of power. If the economy, continues humming along as it has, they just revised GDP for Q4 of last year to almost 3%. There may be more tax dollars, but we are running pretty significant deficits at this point. So I think the FY18 numbers are really solid and likely to be where we're at moving into 2019. So I will stop there on 18 and 19 and talk a little bit about policy. So ESSA, let's talk implementation. 34 states plus DC and Puerto Rico are approved with their state plans. Texas was just approved this week. 17 still remain. Poor Colorado, Emily, I'm sorry. Colorado has still not been approved. They were one of the original 17 that came in September of last year, and they are still not approved, which I find very interesting and unusual. Now, DeVos was really critical of state plans. She was before the Council of Chief State School Officers a couple of weeks ago and criticized the states for the lack of innovation and I think, in her words, ambition in the state plans. And of course, that went over so well, as you can imagine. I'm being very facetious here. So there was a lot of controversy over that. The states did not appreciate that and actually pointed the finger back at the department and said, well, the process you put together, the application you had us fill out, and frankly, the complete lack of guidance really left us with not a lot of options here to go kind of all in and do this really extensive, complicated type application for ESSA, their state plans. Now, some states did do that. It's true. They could. A lot of states, though, I think in an abundance of caution, chose to put in what they thought was what was absolutely needed to get approval and not a whole lot more. So bottom line here is Jason Botel, who is actually still at the department. The rumors of his departure were, I think, fairly overblown. So he is still the Deputy Assistant Secretary in charge of the plan approval process at the U.S. Department of Education. So Jason was, sort of quoted as saying, look, these plans unlock funding. His framing was more around compliance, which wasn't exactly what DeVos was saying a couple of weeks prior, but also talking about, states want to get these dollars, obviously, starting July 1. These plans have to be approved for that funding to happen. Again, if I'm reading between the lines, I think the remaining states will get their plans approved in the not too distant future. I also know that states are proceeding because they don't really have a choice. I mean, we are spring breaking, we are doing state summative testing, and, the end of school, shockingly enough, is not that far away. And states have to start really getting planning in place for the next school year because that's when identification starts with the 18-19 school year and funds start being distributed. So there's a lot of action. These 17 states that are outstanding, I would say California and Florida are two big ones to keep an eye on because in their own separate ways, they're really pushing the envelope in terms of what they're trying to get approved for the ESSA state plans. Both are, I think, going to seek significant waivers to do their plans, and we will see how these play out. But I would guess that those two will be two of the last plans to be approved. So keep your eye on those two states in particular. And then for 18-19, I think it's really important that districts and states, they have a lot more data to be keeping track of, to be reporting, to be making sense of, particularly with schools being identified. Report cards have to be put out. Action needs to be taken against, these different indicators and goals and timelines. And so I think the data needs are going to be pretty severe in terms of the number of data points and the management of those, and pretty extensive as well. So that's another area that I think is going to be an important part. NCLB kind of opened up the data conversation in a lot of ways, and I think ESSA takes it to a whole nother level. So implementation, here's a map of the states that have been approved, the states that have their plans submitted but not yet approved. I'm still, frankly, a little surprised North Carolina hasn't been approved. So there's a few states here that I'm surprised. Kentucky as well. ones to keep your eye on, and they're kind of all over the place. There's no sort of regional focus here, in my opinion. So you can find this, by the way. This is a chart from the 74 million. They get some of their data from the Collaborative for Student Success. So just a nice resource if you ever need to just kind of touch base, check in, see where things are at. Okay, a few more topics on ESSA implementation. So supplement, not supplant. If you recall, ESSA made some pretty significant changes on supplement, not supplant, frankly making it easier and less specific to comply with than was the case under No Child Left Behind. And the department was required to do negotiated rulemaking, which quickly fell apart, and they have not issued any guidance whatsoever on supplement, not supplant. I get the sense the department is maybe thinking about this, but this is really important because it will influence how districts are managing the federal dollars and how they show that the dollars are indeed supplemental and not replacing or supplanting any state or local dollars. Something to keep an eye on, I think, for federal program administrators at the district level. This is an area where there's a lot of unknowns, and they're likely to default to what the requirements were under No Child Left Behind, which are more specific, more detailed, less flexible. So that's an area that I think the department really needs to weigh in on. And then, what about any other guidance? So, for example, what about carryover funds, particularly around school improvement grants? How are those dollars going to be viewed, particularly as new school improvement dollars under ESSA come into play? There's a whole host of other documents and areas that could use guidance from the department. I have no, unfortunately, news to share on any new guidance coming out of the department. In fact, the only thing I've heard is that there's a number of guidance documents that were actually created toward the end of the last administration that just have not been released. I think that's a difficult place to put states and districts in. On the other hand, in the absence of specific rules and guidelines, I think that gives states and districts more flexibility and more room to innovate. So I wish I had more news to tell you, like, hey, in a couple of weeks, we're going to see guidance on supplement, not supplant, or school improvement dollars, or any other topic, but I don't foresee that coming. As I mentioned before, and as I've talked to this group and written about before, we have school improvement deadlines coming up. And, the schools have to be identified, that has to be communicated, interventions, evidence-based interventions need to take place. And there's a little sort of subtext to this conversation. We tend to focus on the comprehensive support and improvement schools, which is the lowest 5%. Then you've got targeted support and improvement. There's a third category in the law called additional targeted support schools. Now, those are schools for which a subgroup or subgroups are very low performing, so low performing that they would be sort of the equivalent of the lowest 5% of schools, meaning the comprehensive support and improvement schools. So this ATS group of schools is an area of focus from congressional Democrats and civil rights groups because they believe the department has been approving plans that commingle TSI schools with ATS schools. Now, why is this important? One, it's an area of controversy, particularly because there's some disagreement among the authors of the bill and disagreement around folks who were supportive of the bill passing. And it's around this focus on subgroups and to what extent do subgroups drive identification, because if you look at the statute, the ATS schools need to be identified sooner and potentially could be on track to become CSI schools sooner and actually have slightly different support requirements. Again, some states kind of combine these groups together, and the question is that okay? Are they handling it in a way that technically passes muster So there's some disagreements between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. And again, back to my prior point around guidance, some additional guidance from the department around how to handle ATS schools would be really important. Now, if all of this is getting to be, just totally confusing, that's because it is. You have seasoned policy people still having disagreements 2+ years after the law was passed around how to handle TSI and ATS schools. Keep an eye on it. It may result in sort of states and districts having to have this third category. My guess is it probably won't unless states decide they really want to separate them out. I still think we'll have CSI and TSI, and how they handle the schools that wind up in TSI may be slightly different if the schools would otherwise qualify for ATS. Okay, enough acronyms on that. Just keep an eye on that, and I will try to keep you updated as well. If you recall, under ESSA, there's requirements around districts and states having to report on their expenditures for students in K-12 and the source of those dollars, so federal, state, and local, and whether those dollars are going for personnel or non-personnel costs. And that deadline was supposed to be this year. It's been pushed back to next year, so there is a delay in terms of when these when these reports on how these dollars are coming in and then being spent. But it is coming. States and districts are working on getting their systems capable of reporting this information. But that financial transparency, one, it's going to, I think, reveal some really interesting spending patterns and discrepancies, frankly. A lot of folks will think that this will highlight some of the disproportionate resource allocations within states and even within districts, because districts have to show this on a school-by-school basis as well as for the district overall. So something to keep an eye on. It's a little bit of a sleeper issue, and it's being postponed, which is probably the right thing to do because a lot of states and districts don't have the systems to accurately do this at this point. But it is coming, and I think will be really useful information when it does. Another area that is a little bit of a sleeper issue is ESSA allows states to reserve 3% of Title II, and now that we have Title II dollars, they can reserve these dollars for principal and leader development and use those dollars at the state level. And there are a number of states, I think by last count, 16 to 18 states are planning to reserve those dollars at the state level. Now, I don't have a specific list. That's just a number I've heard. I think there's a number of states who are not going to keep this set aside at the state level or use this flexibility. And then some states haven't made up their mind. But how states approach this 3% set aside of Title II could potentially drive some decision making and fund allocation. It also has the effect, keep in mind, that if a state reserves 3%, that's 3% fewer dollars that will be made available to districts on a formula basis. So you could see some shifting in Title II from that as well. Okay, we talked about Title IV, more than school safety. Don't forget that Title IV dollars can also be transferred into other titles. So some districts may be choosing to move Title IV dollars that they've received and move those into other titles, particularly Title I, but it could be Title III, could be Title II, which I would doubt. So just keep in mind that Title IV dollars are not only flexible in how they're spent, but they can be moved between other titles. I've talked about the DeVos conflicts and sort of how there's this real disagreement around the treatment of subgroups in particular, and not just around school identification in terms of the CSI, TSI, and ATS, but also some states have decided to use a summative rating, whether that's a grade or a number or some other sort of summative rating for schools. And some states are not necessarily using subgroup performance to drive how those grades or summative scores are ultimately derived. And so Democrats on the Hill and civil rights groups are very worried that there's some lack of focus or emphasis on subgroup performance when you get to the overall performance of schools, and that's an area of concern. No real resolution on that, but it is an area where there's been a lot of back and forth and a lot of concern from Democrats that state plans are being approved that they claim don't follow the letter of the law. Others feel like, well, it's a little bit of a gray area. And I will go back to the fact that with ESSA, there are no regulations, right? So if you recall, the Obama administration put forth some regulations around ESSA. And after the Trump administration came in and Congress was reelected, they threw out those regs. This is one of those areas where a regulation probably could have clarified this, but without that, the statute leaves some room for interpretation, in my opinion, and hence you have some of these disagreements. Two other things on ESSA. We've had some movement on the innovative assessment pilot, and we have 4 states who have expressed interest: Arizona, Hawaii, Louisiana, and New Hampshire. And this is the pilot that really is based on New Hampshire's approach to assessment. So it's rethinking the use of assessment, rethinking the types of assessments, but it's also very difficult because you can't just do kind of a pilot. You have to be on a track to completely redo statewide your entire assessment system, and there's no dollars that accompany this. So I'm not surprised there are very few states who are putting up their hands. I don't think all 4 of these states will actually even make it through the process, but their applications are due actually next week, so not too far away, and we will see who applies, and then, who knows how long it'll take for approvals to come on those, but it's pretty interesting to see what's happening on that. And then weighted student funding, the idea that, you're going to change the distribution of funds depending on student characteristics. This is a pilot authority in ESSA. Up to 50 districts can seek out this particular way of distributing dollars. So far, 5 districts, and Puerto Rico is like Hawaii. It's both a state and a district, so kind of confusing. But Puerto Rico, Indianapolis, and 3 other districts have indicated that they would like to pursue this weighted student funding pilot. It is kind of interesting. Some other districts like Seattle and others who have used a form of weighted student funding with state and local dollars did not express interest. So that's kind of an interesting thing. But there are a handful of districts who are looking to do this. So if those states are, or districts, I'm sorry, I keep saying states, but if those districts are ones that you're working in or interested in or part of, keep your eye on how that may shift the allocation of dollars based on student demographics and other characteristics. Okay, final point. Education savings accounts, ESAs, it's a form of choice. You're probably familiar with it. There's been some proposals to take impact aid and create ESAs for military-connected families and students. Certain conservative groups in DC have been pushing this notion. DeVos has expressed interest in it. Again, one, no authority in the most recent funding legislation to do this. And 2, all of the military groups that have a voice, like the Military Child Education Coalition, the Military Interstate Compact Group, and other military groups, do not support this in any way, shape, or form. But there does seem to be quite a bit of chatter on the Hill around using impact aid to create education savings accounts for military families to give them more spending authority and, frankly, more choices in the form of, going and using these dollars for tuition at other schools, whether public or private. I don't see a lot of traction on this currently, but there is a lot of conversation, and so it's something to keep an eye on. Okay, I'm going to switch gears now. We've talked about funding. We talked about ESSA. Let's talk about IDEA. And I highlight this because this rule was a big deal when it was being formulated under the prior administration, and it's this notion around significant disproportionality. And I'm not going to get into all the weeds on this, partly because of time, but partly because the upshot here is that the Department of Ed is proposing to postpone the implementation of this proposed rule for 2 years. So not starting in July of this year, but actually looking to start it in July of 2020, the implementation of it. Now, that kind of tells me that this rule may never see the light of day if they're going to push it off for 2 more years. It may, or they may go back and try to make significant changes. And there, I think, maybe some different opinions on this topic, but it's really looking at, our students of, particular races or ethnicities being more identified for services, disproportionately identified for special ed services than others. And it's an important topic, and I think there's a lot of data and a lot of conversation around this, but the department is proposing to delay the implementation of this. So once again, something to keep an eye on. If you have an opinion and haven't expressed it to the department, they are still taking comments up until May 14th. And you can go to the Federal Register or the Department of Ed's website and do some just basic Googling around, and you'll be able to find the comment link. So something there that's kind of important that is not happening. Okay, here's our acronym page. We have got more acronyms than you could possibly ever want on this slide. So HEA, the Higher Education Act. It's interesting because some of the controversies that I talked about before between Secretary DeVos and the congressional Democrats is kind of spilling over into HEA. So the Prosper Act passed the House Education Committee. It hasn't hit the House floor. The Senate is working on its version of HEA. And as far as, the rumor mill goes, there's a real lack of bipartisanship in the Senate around HEA reauthorization because of what's been happening with ESSA, where there's these strong disagreements about what the law actually requires. Now, in the House, the Prosper Act passed on a partisan basis. So, truthfully, if I were to sort of put my chips on whether this is going to move any further or not, I would say not, because we are an election year. There's a lot of sort of partisan wrangling around HEA. So there's definitely some action and some movement, but my money would not be on seeing an HEA reauthorization happen this year. What about CTE? What about Perkins? So it passed in the House. It's definitely bipartisan, but it doesn't seem, for whatever reason, and I don't have a lot of insight for you, to be gaining much traction in the Senate. So if there's an education bill that gets across the finish line this year, because maybe folks decide they need a win, a bipartisan win, and something they can go home and campaign on, I would put my money on Perkins making it through. Not a lot of money, mind you, but I would think that has the better chance. What about ESSA, the Education Sciences Reform Act? Also, that created the Institute of Education Sciences, IES. There's some conversation. It was last reauthorized in 2002. I actually worked on that reauthorization and thought that came together pretty well, all things considered. But it is pretty, long time ago. Just makes me feel old. But partly they need to reauthorize this. So there's been some conversation. I don't see a lot of traction on that, and I'll explain more in a minute why that is. But I do want to note that Mark Schneider, who's been at AAR for a long time, was just confirmed to lead IES, and that's significant. IES needs a leader. It needs a full-time appointed leader, and I like Mark. I know him fairly well. I think he will do a very competent job of leading IES. So whether that helps reauthorization, probably not a ton, and primarily because of FERPA. So the data privacy issues in the context of IES, how the data is being used for research, the funding of longitudinal data systems, that continues to be a fairly hot topic. The House held a hearing on data privacy. There weren't fireworks, but they continued to be very concerned about, how federal law treats student data. And to that end, the department recently released a finding. It's called the Agora ruling. And why is it called Agora? Well, there's a cyber charter school in Pennsylvania called Agora. And back in 2012, or actually 13, there were some parents who complained to the department that their FERPA rights were being violated because the school was effectively, and I'm not the expert on this specifically, so you should go read the ruling yourself, but basically the school was saying that as a condition of enrolling in the school, the parents and students had to waive their FERPA privacy rights. I don't know how widespread a practice that is. I would say that's not a very good way to approach FERPA because there are exceptions. And so the department took their time, but I think they came to the right ruling, which was that, schools that are using or require the use of EdTech products that have to be used as a condition of enrollment, they have to ensure that the product either complies with FERPA's school official exemption or the parents have the right to opt out, or frankly, both. And that's, I think, the way most approach FERPA and the use of EdTech products. But if it isn't, then I would be very much paying attention to this ruling because it's fairly recent. I would say within the last month, the ruling came out, so it hasn't sort of fully gotten its way into the system. But it is an important ruling, and I would expect to see, some more activity from the department on FERPA. The student data privacy issues seem to be a little bit more settled down at the state level, but at the federal level, in particular, in regards to IES and the reauthorization of the Education Sciences Reform Act, student data privacy remains a very difficult topic because FERPA probably needs to be updated. Not probably, it does need to be updated. It was written before the internet, before, databases in the cloud and all of the things that we do these days electronically. And so it is in need of updating. And that's another reason why Agora was important, because it does touch on the use of EdTech services. We've talked about some of the department news here. So DeVos is trying to reorganize the department. So, for example, she is proposing to fold the old office I ran, the Office of Innovation and Improvement, into the Office of Elementary and Secondary Ed. She's looking to roll the Career and Tech Ed office into the Office of Post-Secondary. So there's a number of sort of structural changes she's trying to do. In addition, she's also looking at the collective bargaining agreement that exists between the federal government and the union that represents civil service employees. And this is a huge area of conflict. I won't use too colorful of language on this one. So there's huge tension between how the Trump administration and the political appointees are interacting with the civil service union, and how that plays out is important because it's going to affect how the civil service employees of the department, their sort of approach to their roles. And there's a lot of tension and a lot of conflict. So that's pretty unprecedented. The budget service changes, we've talked about that. Interesting in the context of the Agora ruling, they just removed the chief privacy officer and reassigned her to a different role. So I don't know if we're gonna, I think we'll see more FERPA action, but without her sort of in that role of chief privacy officer, we might not. Depends on how quickly they fill that role. There's still very few political appointees at the department. There's no deputy secretary. There's no head of OESE. There's nominees for some of these. And of course, DeVos points the finger at the department. I think Congress says, well, you haven't given us enough appointees to even confirm. And then in the context of the fights over ESSA, there's a higher level of scrutiny. So the department doesn't have as many political appointees. There's a whole bunch of reorganization going on. So why does it matter? How the department's going to approach, are they going to be aggressive in implementation, monitoring, and oversight of ESSA? Hard to say. What is their ability to persuade? I think it's limited because of all of these things going on. And the ability to provide guidance, as I mentioned at the start. There's a lot of guidance that could and should be provided, but with all of these internal struggles going on, I think it really handicaps their ability to get a whole lot done, at least right now. Now, this could all change, but again, the department as a significant actor in some of the issues at the state and local level, sort of like they used to be, definitely don't see that in the near term. So my little image here is the tree that represents the department feels a little bit upside down right now. So what's the net? What does this all mean? I kind of like, the pain meter, how painful, how much pain do you have? And I think where we're at right now is kind of in this range. And ultimately, we're not super happy, I think, with everything that's going on. But all in all, between the funding that's going out now that we've got clarity on, I think some of the policy changes and what states and districts are proposing to do, I think it's a really good time to be in the space, a time for optimism, and sharing some of this with states and districts. I think will only be beneficial to whether you're a company, whether you're a district. I mean, I think there's more to like here than not. So I've talked an awful lot. Hopefully I've given you a ton of information. I do want to leave a few minutes for Q&A. So let me stop here and see if we have any questions that I can respond to.
We definitely have questions, and thank you for providing all of this and such a comprehensive rundown for us. And just to remind folks, you will get a copy of this slide deck as well as the recording. So if you missed anything or didn't take a complete note, you'll have all of this at your fingertips tomorrow. You'll get that by email, and we'll also post it on the Agile website. So yes, we'll take the questions that we can in the time remaining. First being the funding that was just passed, the funding bill, what's the time frame on that money actually being distributed and used?
So it's FY18, so these dollars, will be hitting the districts, it depends. So I don't want to get too technical here because some dollars are forward funded and some dollars are funded on a current basis. But, we are 3/4 of the year into FY18. So how the department ultimately gets these dollars out to the field is a little bit of a question mark. The next big distribution tends to be on July 1st, and then there's a second one in the fall. I would guess that, these dollars are going to be hitting depending on how quickly the department sort of, and this goes back to some of the budget service changes, how quickly they can process, this and make these dollars available to states and districts. I would say, pretty quickly, they're going to try to get these dollars out there because, again, this should have all been done, last October, because that's when the fiscal year started. So, and then, on a go forward basis, some of these dollars realistically may not be actually hitting district budgets until July 1st, because that's when a lot of dollars tend to be made available. So it's going to depend. I wish it was like, hey, they're going to hit, next week. I think the notion here is more of knowing that the dollars are available and being able to plan for the fact that, these increased funds are coming out because, in some cases you have to run them through formulas. Title I has a complicated formula. So adding $300 million, the department has to do some calculations on how those dollars are actually going to get to the states, and then how the states are going to distribute them. So it takes a little bit of time. But again, these are FY18 dollars, and we're in FY18. So I would expect these dollars to be hitting budget. But I think again, the more important thing is the fact that states and districts now know that they've got these resources coming in that they didn't know before. So sometimes they'll be able to have conversations in advance of the actual dollars in the bank, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree that that's sort of the biggest issue is, at least for the time being, some of the uncertainty is gone, that there is something signed and we're going to get some money. So it should move conversations forward for districts. Let's see. We have a company out there who is working with Indianapolis and is wondering for a little more clarification on the difference between weighted student funding and Title I dollars.
Oh boy, we might have to have a separate conversation for that.
All right.
Well, here's what I will say in a quick fashion is Title I is distributed, as I just said, with 4 formulas that have the most to do with how many students in poverty you have, and what is the state's sort of own spending, so the educational finance incentive grant. So, Title I looks at number of students in poverty and kind of what are state and local contributions, and then kind of adjusts from there to a certain degree. So I'm vastly oversimplifying. Weighted student funding is adding in more sort of factors to consider. So, for example, is the student special ed? Is the student have English language needs? Does the student have some other demographic or learning needs that in the mind of the district would require additional resources? And so you overlay sort of these additional weights, and every sort of weighted student funding approach is going to be different. And that's sort of the point, is that no one has the exact same needs. And so how Indianapolis proposes to do weighted student funding is going to be different than other districts and unique to them. Now, it's early days. So, you may want to start looking at district website, reaching out to, district folks that and also just keeping track of the application process, because Indianapolis will have to explain, this is how we're going to sort of shift the weights of the dollars based on additional student-facing criteria, so that's going to change how much a school may receive depending on their proportion of kids who meet those definitions and those weights. So it's a to be determined, but it is something to keep a close eye on.
Okay, we're going to sneak in one last question before we all say goodbye. Under Title IV funding, you mentioned evidence-based activities. Do schools need to have research by a third party to allow funding to implement a resource?
Oh, great question. So there are different tiers of evidence. There are 4 tiers. And depending on how the dollars are being proposed to be used, is going to trigger off different evidence-based requirements. So the good thing, Emily, is that there is a prior, I believe, webinar that deals with some of the evidence-based requirements, but it doesn't necessarily have to be third-party research. There are different levels, and the different levels speak to how developed the research is and how you are proposing to use the activity. So, for example, if you're trying to scale up an activity across an entire district, the research base is going to be higher than if it's an activity that you're looking to do in a cluster of schools and there isn't necessarily a lot of research behind it. There needs to be some level of support to sort of say, hey, this is a promising practice. So the ESSA evidence requirements are not as detailed and specific, and frankly, the bar is more differentiated than it was under NCLB. So it doesn't have to be, a blind, research control trial type evidence base, but depending on how the dollars are proposed to be used, will trigger different evidence-based requirements. So that's a great question. And again, there's a lot of nuance in there that hopefully, we can be a further resource to you on that as well.
Absolutely. And as Doug said, we do have several other webinars about ESSA, and one that did deal pretty specifically with evidence-based. So if you go out to the Agile website, you can find a link to that. So thank you very much, Doug, for joining us and reviewing all of this. And thanks to everyone in the audience who took the time to be with us. So we will be sharing this information through email tomorrow, so keep an eye out. And as Doug said, Agile's got lots of resources to help you navigate this changing market and how to best get your products and services into the hands of teachers and students. So thanks very much, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.